Hello there, friend. I hope wherever you are right now, you're finding a moment of peace in your day. You know, there's something profound that happens when we're pushed to our absolute limit, when the people who are supposed to love us become the architects of our deepest pain, when silence becomes survival and endurance becomes our secret superpower. Today, I want to share with you a story about Sarah, a woman who discovered that sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't what you take from someone, it's what you choose to give them instead. This is a story about invisible scars and quiet strength, about the thin line between justice and mercy, about what happens when the person who broke you breaks themselves. Some of you might recognize pieces of this journey, the weight of carrying secrets, the complexity of loving someone who hurt you. The moment when you realize that your greatest victory might not look anything like what you imagined. So settle in, take a breath, and let's walk through this story together. Because sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not when we fight back, but when we choose something entirely unexpected. Are you ready? Let's begin. Sarah learned to wake up before anyone else in the house. Not because she was a morning person, but because those quiet moments before dawn were the only time she felt truly safe. She would slip out of bed at 5:30, her feet barely making a sound on the old wooden floors. In the kitchen, she'd make herself a cup of tea and sit by the window, watching the world slowly come alive. These were her stolen moments of peace, before the rest of her family stirred and the careful dance of survival began again. To anyone looking from the outside, the Martinez family seemed perfectly normal. A successful father, a loving mother, 2 kids making their way through school. Sarah was the quiet one, the thoughtful daughter who always had her homework done, who never caused trouble, who seemed to glide through life with an almost ethereal calmness. Her teachers called her mature for her age. Her friends' parents wished their own children were as well-behaved and respectful. Even strangers in grocery stores would comment on what a polite, sweet girl she was. But what they didn't see was the way Sarah's shoulders tensed whenever she heard footsteps approaching. How she'd developed an almost supernatural ability to read the emotional temperature of any room within seconds of entering. How she'd learned to make herself smaller, quieter, more invisible with each passing year. At 14, Sarah had already mastered the art of emotional camouflage. She knew exactly how to smile so no one would ask questions, how to laugh at the right moments, even when nothing felt funny, how to carry the weight of 1,000 small cruelties while appearing as light as air. Because in her house, being noticed meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable meant being hurt. So Sarah perfected the delicate balance of being present enough to avoid suspicion, but absent enough to survive. She had become a ghost in her own life, haunting the edges of her family's story. Every morning, Sarah would fold her school uniform with the same methodical precision her grandmother had taught her. Navy blue skirt, white blouse, knee-high socks pulled up just so. She'd learned that looking put together was like wearing armor. It kept people from looking too closely, from asking the kinds of questions she couldn't answer. The walk to school took exactly 12 minutes. Sarah knew this because she'd timed it obsessively, finding comfort in the predictability. She'd take the same route, past Mrs. Chen's flower garden where the roses bloomed in perfect rows, past the corner store where Mr. Rodriguez would wave from behind the counter, past the bus stop where she'd sometimes pause to pet the stray cat that had claimed the bench as home. At school, Sarah was known as the reliable one, the girl who always had an extra pencil, who never forgot her homework, who could be counted on to stay after class to help clean the whiteboards. Her teachers adored her quiet diligence. Her classmates respected her gentle nature, even if they didn't always understand her reserved demeanor. During lunch, while other kids gathered in loud, chaotic groups, Sarah would find a quiet spot under the old oak tree in the courtyard. She'd eat her carefully packed sandwich, always cut diagonally the way she liked it, and lose herself in whatever book she was reading that week. Literature was her escape, her portal to worlds where complicated families found happy endings, where misunderstood characters discovered their worth. After school, she'd take the long way home, sometimes stopping at the public library. The librarian, Ms. Williams, had come to recognize her quiet footsteps among the stacks. Sarah would run her fingers along the spines of books like they were old friends, eventually settling into the same worn armchair by the window where the afternoon light fell just right. These small rituals, the morning routine, the timed walk, the predictable lunch spot, the library visits, weren't just habits. They were lifelines. Each one a small rebellion against the chaos waiting for her at home, a way of creating order in a world that often felt impossibly out of control. But even in these peaceful moments, there was something fragile about Sarah's composure. The way she'd glance over her shoulder when walking alone, how she'd check her phone with a slight tremor in her hands, the careful way she'd listen before opening any door, as if perpetually bracing for something she couldn't quite name. Her friends saw a girl who had it all together. What they couldn't see was someone who'd learned that survival meant staying 3 steps ahead of tomorrow's uncertainty. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Sarah was walking home from the library, her backpack heavy with borrowed books, when she saw the familiar figure waiting by her front door. Marcus was home early from college, and the sight of him made her stomach drop in that old, familiar way. But this time was different. This time, he was holding something in his hands, something that made Sarah's blood turn to ice water in her veins. Her diary. The small, leather-bound journal she'd hidden beneath her mattress. The one place in the world where she'd allowed herself to be completely honest. Where she'd written about the fear, the loneliness, the way his words cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. Where she'd poured out her heart about feeling invisible, unwanted, damaged. Marcus stood there with that smile. That cold, calculated smile she knew meant he'd found a way to hurt her that even she hadn't imagined possible. "Interesting reading," he said, his voice carrying that casual cruelty she'd grown up with. "I had no idea my little sister had such vivid thoughts about our family." The world tilted sideways. Sarah felt like she was drowning in broad daylight, like the ground beneath her feet had simply vanished. Those pages contained her soul, her raw truth, her desperate attempts to make sense of why someone who was supposed to love her seemed to find such pleasure in breaking her down. By the next morning, photocopies of her most vulnerable entries were taped to lockers throughout her school. Her deepest fears, her secret crushes, her anguished questions about why she felt so fundamentally flawed, all of it exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of teenage judgment. The hallways that had once felt like sanctuary became a gauntlet of whispers and stares. Kids she'd known since elementary school looked at her with a mixture of pity and uncomfortable fascination. Some laughed. Others turned away, embarrassed by the raw intimacy of what they'd read. But it wasn't just the humiliation that broke something inside Sarah that day. It was the realization that there was literally nowhere safe. Not her room, not her thoughts, not even the private sanctuary of her own written words. Marcus had violated the last sacred space she had, and he'd done it with the methodical precision of someone who understood exactly how to destroy her most completely. Standing in that hallway, surrounded by the debris of her privacy, Sarah felt something shift deep inside her chest. The quiet girl who'd spent years absorbing his cruelty, who'd made herself smaller and smaller to avoid his attention, suddenly saw the situation with startling clarity. This wasn't love. This wasn't even normal sibling rivalry. This was something much darker, much more deliberate. And for the first time in her life, Sarah felt something she'd never allowed herself to feel before. Anger. Pure, clarifying, transformative anger. That night, Sarah sat on her bedroom floor, surrounded by the torn remains of everything that had once felt sacred to her. The diary pages Marcus hadn't stolen lay scattered around her like fallen leaves, each one a reminder of how completely her safe space had been shattered. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to really cry. Not the quiet, hidden tears she'd learned to shed in silence, but deep, body-shaking sobs that came from a place she'd kept locked away for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. As the tears fell, something strange began to happen. The fog that had surrounded her thoughts for years started to lift, and she began to see her life with a clarity that was both devastating and liberating. She picked up one of the remaining diary pages, dated just 6 months earlier. In her careful handwriting, she'd written, "Maybe if I'm quieter, maybe if I try harder to be good, maybe he'll stop. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I deserve this." Reading those words now felt like looking at a stranger's pain. How had she convinced herself that his cruelty was somehow her fault? How had she spent so many years believing that love was supposed to hurt this much? Sarah walked to her mirror and really looked at herself for the first time in years. The girl staring back at her had gentle eyes and a face that carried too much understanding for 17 years. This wasn't the face of someone who deserved to be torn down. This was the face of someone who'd survived something most people couldn't even imagine. She thought about her classmates' reactions that day. Yes, some had laughed, but others had looked uncomfortable, even angry on her behalf. She realized that normal people don't find joy in someone else's pain. Normal people don't systematically destroy those they're supposed to protect. The problem wasn't her sensitivity or her tears or her need for kindness. The problem was that she'd been trying to find water in a desert, love in a place where it simply didn't exist. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a different life, a life where her thoughts were her own, where vulnerability was met with gentleness instead of exploitation, where she could be fully herself without fear of it being used as ammunition against her. That night, she made 2 promises to herself. First, she would never again give Marcus the power to define her worth. And second, she would never become the kind of person who found strength in making others feel small. She didn't know it yet, but in that moment of complete breakdown, she'd planted the seeds of a transformation that would change not just her life, but eventually, his too. Sometimes we have to fall completely apart to discover who we really are underneath all the ways we've learned to protect ourselves. College became Sarah's sanctuary in ways she'd never imagined possible. 300 miles from home, she discovered something revolutionary. She could exist without constantly bracing for impact. The first time her roommate complimented her laugh, Sarah realized she'd forgotten she even had one. The first time a professor praised her insights in class, she felt a spark of something she'd thought Marcus had extinguished forever, her own voice. Sarah threw herself into psychology courses with the hunger of someone who'd lived inside a puzzle for years and finally found the pieces to solve it. She learned about trauma responses, about gaslighting, about the difference between love and control. Each lecture felt like someone was translating her childhood into a language that finally made sense. She volunteered at the campus crisis center, sitting with students who carried their own invisible wounds. In their stories, she recognized the echo of her own pain, but also something else, the incredible resilience of the human spirit when given space to heal. One evening, while helping a freshman who'd been emotionally manipulated by her boyfriend, Sarah heard herself say words that stopped her cold. "You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Love doesn't require you to disappear." Later that night, alone in her dorm room, those words settled into her bones like a prayer she'd been waiting her whole life to hear. She thought about all the years she'd made herself smaller, quieter, less, believing that was what love required. She thought about Marcus, and for the first time, she didn't feel anger or fear. She felt something unexpected: compassion. Not the kind that excuses or enables, but the kind that sees clearly. Marcus was broken too. Hurt people, and somewhere along the way, he'd learned that power felt safer than vulnerability. That control felt more secure than connection. Sarah realized that her healing didn't require his destruction. In fact, the most powerful thing she could do was become everything he'd tried to convince her she wasn't: whole, strong, and unshakably kind. That night, she began planning not revenge, but something far more revolutionary: freedom. The phone call came on a rainy Thursday morning, 7 years after Sarah had graduated and built a life that felt entirely her own. Her mother's voice was shaky, unfamiliar in its vulnerability. "Sarah, honey, it's Marcus. He's lost everything. The business failed, Amanda left him, and he's about to lose the house. Your father and we're too old to help him the way he needs. And we were wondering." Sarah sat in her cozy apartment, surrounded by plants that thrived under her care, photos of friends who cherished her exactly as she was, and books that had helped her understand both the darkness and the light in human nature. For a moment, she was 17 again, bracing for impact. But then something extraordinary happened. Instead of the old familiar panic, she felt calm. Not the brittle, fragile calm of someone holding their breath, but the deep, rooted calm of someone who had learned their own worth and wouldn't be moved from it. That afternoon, Sarah made a series of phone calls. Not to Marcus, but to her network: the therapist who had helped her heal, the career counselor who specialized in second chances, the nonprofit organization she'd quietly supported for years that helped people rebuild their lives. She didn't do it with fanfare or announcements. She didn't even tell her parents. Instead, Sarah orchestrated Marcus's rescue like a guardian angel he'd never see. An anonymous scholarship for therapy, a job interview arranged through a professional contact who knew nothing of their history. Rent assistance from a charity program that existed only because Sarah funded it herself. Within 6 months, Marcus was stabilizing. He had a job, a small apartment, and most importantly, a therapist who was helping him understand the difference between strength and cruelty. Sarah watched from a distance as her brother slowly transformed into someone she barely recognized, someone humble, grateful, genuinely remorseful for the pain he'd caused others throughout his life. The most beautiful part wasn't his change, though. It was Sarah's realization that helping him hadn't diminished her or reopened old wounds. She was whole enough, strong enough, healed enough to extend grace without losing herself. She had become the person she'd always needed to be. 3 years later, Marcus called Sarah on her birthday. His voice was different, softer, humbled by the kind of genuine remorse that can only come from truly seeing yourself clearly. "Sarah," he said, and she could hear him struggling with words that had taken him years to find. "I need to tell you how sorry I am, not just for the diary thing, but for everything. For all the years I made you feel small, for stealing your childhood peace, for being the kind of brother who hurt instead of protected." Sarah listened, holding the phone with steady hands, her heart full but calm. When he finished, she simply said, "I forgive you, Marcus. And I love you." She never told him about the anonymous help, the invisible hand that had lifted him when he'd fallen. That wasn't the point. The point was that somewhere along the way, Sarah had discovered that healing doesn't require the other person to earn it. Sometimes we heal not for them, but for ourselves. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to let someone else's brokenness break us too. You know, we all carry people in our hearts who have hurt us, family members who should have protected us but didn't, friends who betrayed our trust, people who saw our vulnerability and chose cruelty instead of kindness. And we have a choice. We can let that pain turn us hard and bitter. We can spend our lives waiting for apologies that may never come, Or we can choose something revolutionary. We can choose to heal regardless of whether they ever do. Sometimes the person we save by choosing forgiveness isn't the one who hurt us. Sometimes the person we save is ourselves. Sometimes the most beautiful revenge is refusing to become the kind of person who needs it. And sometimes, just sometimes, when we choose to love despite having every reason not to, we discover that love was always our greatest strength, not our greatest weakness. Thank you for walking through this story with me today. May you find your own path to peace.